Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It had been a long day. My feet ached from standing on them for hours, my mind was numb from the endless tasks, and the drive home was something I looked forward to. I always took the same route, down the same streets, passing the same landmarks. The familiarity of it was comforting. But that evening, something felt different. It started with the streetlights. As I turned onto the usual road, the warm yellow glow of the streetlights flickered, casting odd shadows on the pavement. I brushed it off, maybe it was just the light bulbs. But then, I noticed the silence. It was almost too quiet. There was no hum of distant traffic, no murmur of people. Just the sound of my car tires against the asphalt. Even the trees seemed still, their leaves unmoving despite the breeze I could feel through the cracked window. The further I drove, the stranger it felt. The streets looked the same, but something about them felt off. I passed the small coffee shop I usually saw at the corner, but it wasn't there anymore. In its place stood an old, run-down building I didn't recognize. It was dark, windows boarded up. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly convinced myself it was just a new renovation, something I hadn't noticed before. I took a right at the next intersection, a turn I made almost every day, but the road didn't look familiar. The buildings were different, dilapidated, like something from an old horror movie. I slowed the car, squinting to make sure I hadn't missed something, but no. This was wrong. The road curved and twisted in ways it never had before, the shadows growing deeper, more oppressive. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. There had to be an explanation for this. Maybe I was just tired, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I reached for my phone, ready to use the map to find my bearings, but the screen was black. It didn't even respond to my touch. I felt a cold shiver run down my back. I looked up again, but the road kept shifting, stretching into places I didn't recognize. The street signs were faded, almost unreadable. A chill filled the air, the silence now broken by the faintest rustle of leaves that sounded like distant footsteps, soft, yet unmistakable. I pressed the gas pedal, trying to make sense of it. There had to be a way out of this, a way back to the familiar. But the further I drove, the more the world around me seemed to twist, like reality itself was bending in on itself. The trees now loomed over the road like dark sentinels, their branches stretching out in unnatural angles, casting long, jagged shadows across the asphalt. A sudden, sharp noise echoed through the stillness. I froze, gripping the wheel tightly, my breath shallow. It sounded like a footstep, but not from the ground. From above. The air itself seemed to be alive, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I needed to get out of here. I needed to go home. But the road stretched on, endless, unyielding. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel, the harsh sound echoing in the quiet air. My pulse raced, my mind screaming at me to turn around, but the road had become a maze, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. I couldn't remember where I had gone wrong. The world outside my car felt unfamiliar, hostile, like it had morphed into something I couldn't comprehend. I kept driving, hoping to find something, anything, that would make sense of this growing nightmare. but every turn only seemed to bring me deeper into the unknown. The buildings around me were more than just old. They were decaying, rotting. Windows were cracked, and some were completely shattered. The streetlights, now buzzing erratically, cast shadows that moved as if alive, stretching unnaturally long and swaying like they had a will of their own. The rustling noise that had started earlier grew louder. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a stray dog or something harmless. But the sound was wrong, like someone was walking behind me. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. Just darkness. Nothing that could explain the cold, creeping dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I glanced at the dashboard. The time was flickering, changing every few seconds. Minutes turning into hours and back into minutes in a confusing blur. I reached for my phone again, desperate to call someone, but it was still black, unresponsive. My fingers trembled as I put it back down, my frustration mounting. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but something felt wrong about the very air around me. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. It felt like the world had stopped, and I was the only one left in it, trapped in a twisted reflection of the reality I knew. And then, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the street. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could make out the outline of a person standing motionless in the dim light. It was too still, too unnatural. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, standing alone in the dark? I slowed the car, my grip tightening on the wheel. The figure didn't move. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Their silhouette was dark against the faint glow of the streetlight, their features indistinct. I leaned forward, my breath fogging up the windshield as I tried to make sense of it. Suddenly, the figure moved. Not toward me, but to the side, just a few feet to the left, slipping into the shadows with an unnerving swiftness. I jerked the car forward, my foot pressing on the gas without thinking. I needed to get away. I couldn't stay here, in this place, any longer. But the road didn't lead anywhere. The more I drove, the more the scenery distorted, blending into one long stretch of nothing. The same buildings. The same empty streets. And still, that feeling, the creeping, suffocating sensation that something was following me. Watching me. I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, movement. Something shifting in the shadows. The figure. No, not just one figure. There were more now. I could see them flickering in the distance, always just out of reach, always too far for me to make out clearly. But I could feel their presence, growing, closing in on me with every passing second. The rustling had turned into footsteps, real and heavy, dragging against the pavement. I could hear them now, unmistakable. Each step echoed louder than the last, as if something, or someone, was closing the distance between us. I looked ahead. The street was ending. There was no escape. My eyes darted from side to side, searching for any sign of life, of help. But there was nothing. Only the sound of those footsteps, the growing chorus of them, getting closer, getting louder. I slammed the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, the tires skidding slightly before coming to a stop. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. A whisper. Barely audible at first, but it grew, growing into a voice that chilled me to the bone. Turn around. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. My eyes shot around the car, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was nothing. No one. The streets were empty, save for the creeping shadows and the oppressive silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. My breath caught in my throat, panic welling up inside me. The voice wasn't in my head. I could hear it clear as day, as if it had come from just behind me. "Turn around," it repeated, its tone cold and firm. I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was behind me, what had followed me. But something in that voice made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't an offer of safety. It was a command, and I had to obey it. I slowly turned my head, my heart thudding against my ribs, and I saw nothing. There was no one in the back seat. The car was empty. But the sensation of eyes watching me remained heavy, suffocating. I turned back to the front. The street had changed again. It wasn't just the buildings now, it was everything. The road ahead seemed darker, deeper, as if the night itself was swallowing me whole. The trees on the side of the road were closer, their branches reaching out like fingers, clawing at the car. The once familiar world had turned into something twisted and alien. The whisper came again, louder this time, like it was right next to my ear. "Turn around. Turn back." I didn't know what it meant. The road I had been driving on didn't exist anymore, and the streets I had passed were gone. Everything was different, distorted. It was as if reality itself was unraveling. I couldn't tell if it was my mind breaking down or something more sinister. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, but before I could open the door, a loud bang came from outside the car. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. It was like something had hit the car, something heavy. The windows rattled, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of breathing, hot and ragged, against the glass. I froze, staring at the reflection of the trees outside, their shapes warping and contorting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The breathing was gone. The banging ceased. But the silence, it was worse now. It was suffocating. My mind raced, every thought drowned out by the creeping dread that grew louder with each passing second. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place, but the road ahead kept changing, the path never leading to anything familiar. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was being pulled deeper into whatever this was, this place that wasn't real. The footsteps that had followed me before were now echoing in the distance again. They were closer now, growing louder, faster. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, forward, behind, or from the shadows that clung to the sides of the car. "Turn around," the voice commanded once more. "You shouldn't have come this far." I wasn't sure what to do. My mind was a mess of fear and confusion. I looked out the window, trying to see if I could spot anything that would help me understand what was happening. The road, the streetlights, the buildings, all of it felt wrong, like I had crossed some invisible line that separated reality from whatever this was. I pressed the gas pedal, my hands shaking, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to move, to escape. But the car didn't speed up. It barely crawled forward, as though the very air around me was pushing against it, holding it back. I could feel the weight of something pressing on me from all sides, suffocating, pulling me into a darkness that wasn't just the absence of light, but something far more terrifying. A shadow passed by the car window, so quick that I barely had time to react. But I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, its shape flickering like it was part of the shadows themselves. I blinked, and it was gone. But the sound of footsteps continued, closer now, unmistakable. They weren't just behind me anymore, they were all around me, closing in. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. It was there, out of sight, waiting for me to stop. And then, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something in the rearview mirror, a figure in the back seat, staring at me with empty eyes, its face twisted into something unrecognizable. I turned quickly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but there was nothing there. But that whisper, it wasn't gone. Turn around. This time, it wasn't just a command. It felt like a warning. My hands were clammy as I gripped the wheel, my mind swirling with panic. I had no idea where this road was taking me, or if I could even escape it. But I knew one thing for sure. The longer I stayed, the less I recognized the world around me. And the more I heard those footsteps, always closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. Every inch of the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into nothingness, and with each passing second, the shadows around me grew darker, more menacing. My eyes flicked from side to side, desperate for some sign of life, something that could pull me out of this nightmare. But there was nothing. Just the road, the whispering voice, and the footsteps that never stopped. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but the car barely moved. The engine sputtered and groaned, as if the weight of the atmosphere itself was weighing it down. The silence that had once been a heavy presence was now replaced with a suffocating stillness, broken only by the sound of my own breath and the constant, steady thumping of my heart in my ears. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting. I glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, my reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. The reflection was normal, but something was wrong. The air around me shimmered, as if reality itself was starting to warp. My hands clenched tighter on the steering wheel, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. The dread that had been creeping at the edges of my mind now surged forward, threatening to consume me whole. Without warning, the car jerked violently to the left, throwing me off balance. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching as I tried to regain control. The car spun slightly before halting, now facing a new path, one I hadn't seen before. The road ahead was dark, almost pitch black, the streetlights far too distant to provide any real comfort. The atmosphere felt thick, oppressive, like the very air was charged with an unseen force. And then, I saw it. At the end of the street, standing alone in the darkness, was the same figure I had seen earlier, the one that had moved in and out of the shadows. This time, it didn't flicker. It didn't shift. It was solid, standing perfectly still, its form obscured by the darkness, but the outline unmistakable. The shape of a person. Turn around, the voice came again, this time more insistent, almost desperate. You're too close. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to drive, to leave, but my body refused to move. It was like I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot. I watched the figure, its presence drawing me in, despite every instinct telling me to turn away. The streetlights flickered once more, casting brief flashes of light that illuminated parts of the figure's face, if you could call it a face. The light revealed hollow eyes, dark and empty, and a mouth twisted into a thin, unnerving grin that seemed to grow wider with each passing second. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if the figure was really moving. Its head tilted slightly, a soundless gesture that felt as though it was watching me, studying me. It knew I was there. It knew I was trapped. The air grew colder, and with it, the sense of danger increased tenfold. The shadows around me felt alive now, stretching out like hands, reaching, clawing at the car. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt as though I was suffocating under the weight of the dread pressing in from every direction. I forced myself to turn the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. For a moment, nothing happened. My heart skipped a beat. Was I stuck here? Was this it? I glanced back at the figure, the grin still widening, the dark eyes seeming to burn with an eerie intensity. Then the car roared to life, the engine sputtering before it surged forward, tearing down the road. I didn't care where it led, I just needed to escape. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my eyes fixed on the path ahead. But it wasn't over. The moment the car began to move, the footsteps started again. Faster now. Closer. A rhythmic pounding, relentless and heavy, like a drum beat that echoed through the air, drowning out everything else. The road in front of me was changing again. The familiar buildings had disappeared, replaced by endless rows of abandoned houses, their windows dark and empty. The streetlights no longer flickered, they were gone, leaving nothing but the oppressive darkness around me. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was there again, now standing in the middle of the road behind me. I couldn't see its face anymore, only the silhouette, growing larger, looming closer. It moved with unnatural speed, like it was gliding rather than walking. The voice came again, closer this time, as if it was right beside me, whispering in my ear. Turn around. You can't outrun it. I didn't know what it was. But I knew, in that moment, that the figure wasn't the real threat. It was something worse, something that had been lurking, waiting for me to cross into this place. The shadows were alive. The road itself was alive. And I wasn't meant to be here. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my heart in my throat. The figure was gone, but the footsteps were still there, louder now, as if something was right behind me, breathing down my neck. Suddenly, I slammed the brakes. The car stopped. And for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a figure appeared in the rearview mirror, closer than ever before. Its hollow eyes stared into mine, its smile wide and unnaturally stretched. It reached out, fingers brushing the window. And as the figure's shadow enveloped the car, I realized one horrifying truth. I hadn't been driving home at all. I had been heading further away from it. Further away from anything familiar. And now, I was stuck here, trapped in a place where reality no longer made sense. Trapped with them. The figure in the rearview mirror loomed closer, its outstretched hand pressing against the glass. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow crawled across the window, as if trying to slip inside, to crawl into the car with me. I could hear its breath now, ragged and hollow, as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to stop. I couldn't move. The air in the car was thick, suffocating. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, but I couldn't make myself drive forward. The road ahead had dissolved into nothing, and the world around me was slipping further away. All I could see was the figure in the rearview mirror, its face now twisted in an impossibly wide grin, its eyes black voids staring into my soul. The voice came again, this time softer, almost gentle. Turn around, it whispered. You can still go back. The words felt like a lie. How could I go back? There was no back anymore. No familiar streets, no sense of home. This place, this nightmare, had consumed everything I knew. The more I tried to escape, the more it twisted itself around me, pulling me deeper into its grip. I looked ahead. The road stretched into an endless, black void. I couldn't go forward. I couldn't go back. I was trapped. The footsteps were getting louder again, but now they weren't just behind me. They were everywhere. In the car. Beside me. Above me. Around me. 1,000 footsteps, all at once, like the sound of something closing in, 1,000 eyes watching, waiting for me to make a decision. I glanced at the rearview mirror once more. The figure was gone, but I could feel its presence, like it was hovering just behind me, ready to strike. I had no choice but to act. With a trembling hand, I turned the key in the ignition again. The engine roared to life with a sudden surge, but this time it wasn't enough. The car lurched forward, but it didn't move. The air around me thickened, the shadows pressing in, suffocating me, as if the very world was conspiring to keep me here. Then, a cold breeze swept through the car, and the radio crackled to life. The static was deafening at first, then faded into a distorted voice. "Turn around," it said, louder this time, "or be swallowed whole." The fear inside me reached its peak, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed my foot on the gas again, this time harder, desperate to escape. The car jerked forward, and for a moment, I thought it would break free from the grip of this place. But as I looked out the windshield, my heart sank. The road ahead was the same endless stretch of nothingness. The same dark, decaying buildings. The same twisted shadows. The world around me was collapsing, folding in on itself. I glanced to my right, and there, standing in the darkness, where the trees had once been, was another figure. This one wasn't as far away as the others had been. This one was standing right beside the car, its face pressed against the window. It was a woman, but her face was distorted, like something out of a nightmare. Her eyes were wide and empty, her mouth open in a silent scream, her skin stretched too tight, as if it couldn't contain whatever was inside her. I screamed, but the sound didn't come. My throat felt like it was closing in on itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I was left with nothing but the deafening silence, the cold that had seeped into my bones, and the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. The road was still there, but now I realized something that chilled me to the core. There was no escape. I wasn't meant to find my way back. There was no home anymore. I had driven into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The figures weren't just figments of my imagination. They were part of this place, this twisted reality that had swallowed me whole. I had crossed a line, and now there was no returning to what I once knew. The voice whispered again, this time softer, as if it was speaking directly to me. "You've made your choice." I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but there was no one to hear me. The world around me had become a reflection of my own fear, of the hopelessness that now gripped my soul. I had turned, I had driven, and now I was here, trapped in a never-ending cycle, lost in the darkness. And as the figure reappeared in the rearview mirror, its smile wide and knowing, I realized the truth. I wasn't going home. I never would. The long road home had led me to a place I could never escape. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if something, or someone, was watching you from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known? Something you couldn't see, something you couldn't explain. That's exactly how it started for me. Something so simple, so ordinary, yet so disturbing that it slowly twisted everything I thought I knew into something dark. I didn't know what to expect when I first found the phone. It was late. The office was empty, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. It was one of those quiet nights where everything seemed fine until it wasn't. I had been working late, as usual, and I was the last to leave. The building, like most office buildings, was too silent for comfort at night. Every sound echoed through the empty hallways, making the place feel bigger, colder, more alien. I had always hated that feeling of being alone, but tonight it was different. There was an unease in the air, as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I was headed to the basement to grab some files, a task I had been putting off for days. The basement was the least visited part of the office, and for good reason. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, uneven shadows across the concrete floors, making it feel less like a storage room and more like a tomb. I had been down there dozens of times, but tonight the air felt heavier. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the familiar sounds now amplified in the silence. As I walked past the rows of old filing cabinets, I noticed something strange, an old phone sitting on a small wooden table in the far corner of the room. At first, I thought nothing of it. An old landline, probably left behind by someone who used to work here. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The phone wasn't plugged in. There was no cable, no connection. It was just sitting there, perfectly still, like it was waiting for something, someone. I don't know why, but I reached out and picked it up. My fingers hovered over the receiver for a moment, hesitant, before I placed it to my ear. Nothing. I sighed in relief, telling myself it was just an old relic, a forgotten piece of equipment that had long since stopped working. I was about to set it back down when I heard a faint click. It sounded like a dial tone, but it wasn't the normal dial tone. It was something different. A low hum, almost like a breath, but too mechanical, too wrong. Then, a voice. A single word. My name. David. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the phone away from my ear, as if the sound might physically hurt me. I stood there, in the dim light of the basement, staring at the receiver in disbelief. Who could have been calling? There was no one else in the building, and no one had access to the basement at this time of night. The voice, though, it was unmistakable. It had been clear, deep, and somehow familiar. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it was late, I was tired, and the silence of the basement was starting to mess with my mind. I set the phone back down carefully, my hands still trembling, and made my way back upstairs. But that was only the beginning. That night, I tried to forget about the phone. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a strange noise in an empty building. But when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard it again. A ringing sound, faint but unmistakable, like the echo of a phone in another room. It grew louder, clearer, until I could hear it in my ears. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. It wasn't the phone from the office. It was my phone, the one on my nightstand. I hesitated before I reached for it, my hand hovering just above the receiver. When I picked it up, there was nothing, no dial tone, no message. Just the faintest breath on the other end. Then, the same voice. David. It was him again. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make any sense. The phone call was impossible. There was no reason for it. But it kept happening. Every night, at the same time. It wasn't just a random call. It was deliberate. It was waiting. And each time, the same thing happened. The same word. My name. It was like the phone was calling to me, pulling me back, reminding me of something I couldn't remember, something I didn't want to. And every time it rang, I felt myself slipping further into something dark. Something I couldn't escape. I didn't know who was calling me. I didn't know why they were calling. But I knew one thing for sure. The calls weren't going to stop. And neither would I. Not until I figured out what the hell was going on. The next night was the same. I tried to ignore it, to let sleep take me, but it was impossible. The weight of the phone call from the previous night pressed heavily on me, a constant gnawing feeling in my stomach. I had never experienced anything like that before. It was as if the voice on the other end knew me, really knew me, like it was calling from some deep, hidden part of my life that I couldn't quite remember. And then, as if to prove the absurdity of it all, the phone rang again. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt too quiet, too still, like the entire world had paused, holding its breath. For a moment, I just stared at the phone. It wasn't the office phone, but it was the same number. The same voice. David. There it was again. That single word, as cold as it was familiar, whispered through the receiver. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring at the phone. The voice was distant, but I could feel it in my chest, as if it were a part of me now, tied to something I couldn't see. The fear began to build, gnawing inside me, a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. Who was it? And why were they saying my name? The voice didn't offer any comfort, any answers. Just my name. David. It was as if it was calling to me, beckoning me. What did it want? I wanted to hang up. I wanted to leave it all behind and go back to the normal world. But something stopped me. Something in that voice made me hesitate, like I was afraid I might miss something if I didn't listen. I lifted the receiver slowly, my hand trembling. Hello? I said, my voice sounding strange, foreign to my own ears. Nothing. Just silence, thick and heavy. My breath felt loud in the stillness. The seconds stretched into eternity. And then, a faint sound. A rustling, like someone moving in the dark. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to make sense of it. I could hear it now, just barely, as if it were coming from far away, whispering. David. The voice was closer now, but it still sounded wrong. Like it wasn't coming from the phone at all. It was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere closer. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my heart racing. Sweat beat on my forehead, and the air felt thick, suffocating. What was happening? Who was calling me, and why didn't they say anything else? Why only my name? I could feel the panic setting in, a slow, creeping terror that wasn't just in my mind anymore, it was all around me. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, the space shrinking with every second. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway, watching me. But there was nothing. Nothing but the flickering of the lights and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Everything seemed so ordinary. Yet nothing felt normal. I hung up. I had to. The phone was silent now, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I sat in the dark for a long time, just staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. But nothing made sense. Not anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper again. David. I couldn't escape it. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next evening, when I returned to the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The building was still, as quiet as ever. But there was an underlying hum to it now, a feeling of something lurking just out of sight, waiting. I couldn't stop thinking about the phone in the basement. I hadn't gone back down there since the first call, and something told me I shouldn't. But my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know if the phone was still there, if the calls would come again. I made my way down to the basement, each step echoing in the emptiness, louder than I expected. The air was musty and thick, the shadows cast by the low, flickering light stretching unnaturally across the walls. It felt colder down here than usual, and a chill ran down my spine as I approached the corner where the phone had been. But it was gone. My heart stopped. The table was still there, but the phone was nowhere to be found. It didn't make sense. I had just left it there yesterday. I checked every corner of the basement, searching for it, my pulse quickening with every empty shelf, every darkened space. But there was nothing. The phone had vanished. I had a sudden, overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned around quickly, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway, watching me. But there was no one. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, paralyzed by the creeping dread. And then, just as I was about to leave, the phone rang. The sound echoed through the basement, sharp and clear, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the same phone, the one that hadn't been there a moment ago. I could hear the faint buzz of the line, the static crackling in the silence. And then, once again, that voice. David. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a phone call. This wasn't just a coincidence. It had to be something else. Something I couldn't explain. And I couldn't escape it. The ringing didn't stop. It felt like a weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stood there, frozen, unable to move or even think straight. The basement was silent now, the only sound the echo of my own pulse pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure how to react. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet were glued to the spot. It was as if something invisible was holding me in place, forcing me to listen, forcing me to confront whatever was on the other side of that phone. The voice, that voice, it was as clear as ever, and yet it felt wrong, like it was being pulled from some place I couldn't reach. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried through the static, but it grew louder, clearer with each passing second. David. The voice wasn't threatening, not in the traditional sense. It didn't yell, didn't demand anything. It was calm, almost comforting in a way. But that was what made it worse. It was too familiar. Too intimate. I took a tentative step forward, my legs feeling like they were made of stone. The phone sat on the table where I had last seen it, its receiver just slightly lifted, as if waiting for me to answer. The air in the basement felt colder, almost as if the temperature had dropped suddenly, a chill seeping into my bones. I could see my breath, faint and white in the dim light, and I knew something wasn't right. I had to know. I had to know who was calling me. I reached out, my hand shaking as it hovered over the receiver. My fingers brushed against the plastic, sending a jolt of cold through me. And then, almost like an instinct, I picked it up. The silence hit me first. Complete, absolute silence. The world around me seemed to stop. The hum of the lights, the creak of the floorboards, everything faded away, leaving just the phone, just the voice. David. My name again. This time, though, it wasn't just a word. It felt like a command. Like it was pulling me into something. I opened my mouth, wanting to speak, wanting to ask who was on the other end, but nothing came out. My throat felt tight, as if I couldn't force the words through. There was no breath to my voice, only the cold, silent air between us. The basement suddenly seemed much larger, as if the shadows were stretching further, closing in. I turned to look behind me, my eyes darting around, scanning the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. Then the static crackled, and the voice returned, louder now, clearer. But it was different. It wasn't just calling my name anymore. Come, it said. The word echoed in my mind, its meaning stretching beyond just a simple command. It was like an invitation or a warning. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, I thought I could hear something else. Something faint, something moving, just on the edge of my hearing. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one. The air grew heavier. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs, and yet my body felt strangely detached from it all, like I was observing myself from a distance. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The phone line was still live, the static filling the space, but there was no more voice. Only the hum of the connection. And then, in the distance, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A sound, soft at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking toward me, their steps slow, deliberate, echoing in the basement. I turned again, this time frantic, but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them now, so close that I could almost feel them, the vibration of each step making the floor beneath me tremble. But there was no one there. Not a shadow, not a figure. And then the voice came again, a whisper this time, so close that I could feel it in my bones. David, come. The phone in my hand was still warm, the connection still live, but the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It was as if the air had solidified around me, trapping me in place. I could feel it then. Something in the room with me. Something invisible, something watching me. I had no choice. I had to leave. I dropped the phone. The sound of it hitting the table echoed through the room, sharp and final. The footsteps stopped. The air felt still again, unnaturally so. But I didn't wait to find out what happened next. I ran. The basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, standing on the sidewalk in the cold night air, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. But as I looked back at the office building, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever had called my name was still there, waiting for me to come back. And worst of all, I knew I would. Because somehow, deep down, I felt that it wasn't just the phone. It wasn't just the basement. It was something far worse. Something that was following me now. And it knew my name. The calls weren't just a warning anymore. They were a promise. The days that followed felt like I was walking in a fog. Every moment seemed to stretch into the next, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The office was the same as it had always been, quiet, familiar, but it was all wrong now. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining things, that the phone call, the footsteps, were all just tricks my mind had played on me in a moment of stress. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice. David. A whisper, like a shadow in the dark. It followed me everywhere, even into my dreams. I kept the lights on at night, couldn't bear the thought of the darkness surrounding me, of the quiet stretching on too long. My every movement felt careful, deliberate, like I was trying to avoid triggering something, a presence that was always just beyond my reach. And then, the phone call came again. It wasn't at night this time. It was in the middle of the day, just as I was finishing up some paperwork in my office. The sudden ring cut through the silence, sharp and unexpected, making me jump in my seat. My heart raced, a primal fear blooming in my chest. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but the ring was persistent, relentless. I glanced at the caller ID. It was the same number, the number that had haunted me. For a moment, I didn't move. My fingers hovered over the desk, my palms sweating. Should I pick it up? Should I leave it? The silence in the office felt unbearable, like the phone was calling out to me, urging me to answer. David. It was the voice again. The same voice. Clear, cold, but this time there was something else to it. Something more insistent. I slammed the phone down without thinking, the sharp click of the receiver almost deafening in the quiet room. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I had to fight the urge to look behind me. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger, as if someone were standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I turned to the window, hoping the sunlight would reassure me, but all I saw was the reflection of the office, the glass now distorted by the unease curling in my stomach. The voice on the other end of the line wasn't just calling me anymore. It was summoning me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. Something was changing, something I couldn't understand, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I left the office that day with my mind racing. I had to get away, to clear my head, but no matter where I went, that feeling of being followed didn't leave. It was as if the world itself had shifted, become a little more off, a little less real. Every shadow seemed too deep, every corner too dark. I tried to shake it off. I tried to pretend everything was fine, but the phone kept calling. That night, it rang again. I didn't even have to look at the screen. I knew it would be the same. The same voice. The same word. David. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But that didn't stop the voice from lingering. It filled the room as if the air itself was charged with it. It was like I could hear it even when the phone was silent. And then, something else happened. The sound of a door opening, my door, came from somewhere in the apartment. Slowly at first, like the creak of old wood, but then it grew louder, as if someone, or something, was walking in, moving closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the sound. My apartment was supposed to be empty. I lived alone. No one was supposed to be there. But there it was again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing across the floor behind me. I spun around, every muscle on my body tensed, ready to flee. But the room was empty. Empty, except for the phone, which had begun to ring again. I picked it up, my hand trembling as it hovered over the receiver. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know who was on the other end. The voice had been calling me for days, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew I wouldn't be able to. Hello? My voice was barely a whisper, barely enough to break the silence, but it didn't matter. The voice came through, clearer than before. David. I felt my knees give out, and I sank to the floor. The room spun around me as if the very air was alive, swirling in a vortex of dread. I could feel it, whatever it was, closing in. And then, there was a new sound. A sound I hadn't heard before, but one that filled me with an icy terror. Breathing. Heavy, uneven, just on the edge of my hearing. It was close, too close. I could feel it, the warm, shallow breath on the back of my neck, but when I turned, there was nothing. Only darkness. I slammed the phone down, my breath ragged, my heart racing in my chest. The room was suffocating now, closing in, the walls pressing against me, as if something or someone was waiting, lurking, just out of sight. I ran to the door, desperate to escape, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't open. The door was locked. I tried again, and again, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of my own panicked breathing was the only thing I could hear now, and that, too, felt wrong. Too loud. Too real. And then, finally, I heard it again. David. The voice was right behind me now, right at my ear. A whisper, cold and empty, sending a jolt of terror through my entire body. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My feet were frozen in place. I wasn't alone. I never had been. The world felt like it was crumbling around me. Every breath was a struggle, and every beat of my heart echoed like a drum in my ears. I could hear the voice, always so close, always so clear, whispering my name again and again, as if it were an insistent chant that wouldn't let go. David. David. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape this nightmare. I tried the door once more, desperation surging through my veins, but it didn't budge. The sound of the voice grew louder, filling the room, seeping into the very walls. And then I felt it. A pressure on my chest, as if something was leaning in, right behind me, so close I could almost feel its breath on my skin. I turned. There was nothing there. Just empty space. But the air was thick, like it was alive, like it was moving around me, pushing in, suffocating me. My eyes darted to the phone, still on the floor, its receiver hanging loosely, as if waiting for me to pick it up again. But I didn't want to. I couldn't. I stumbled back, trying to find the exit, trying to remember if I had another door in the room. But all I saw were shadows, stretching longer and longer, as if they were reaching out for me. The silence was unbearable. The voice had stopped, but something worse had taken its place. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, came again. Only this time, they were inside my head, resonating through my skull. The footsteps were no longer a sound I could hear. They were something I could feel. The floor beneath me trembled with each step, each movement, each shift. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the door, my body frozen, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The door opened. It wasn't the way it was supposed to open. There was no key, no unlock. It simply opened, as if someone had willed it into being. The gap widened, and I could see a sliver of the hallway beyond, the soft light from the street lamp casting long shadows across the floor. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But I couldn't move. A voice, not the voice on the phone, but something darker, something closer, whispered through the cracks of the door. "Come, David. We've been waiting." The words scraped against my mind like nails on a chalkboard, sending a chill down my spine. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to the ground. I couldn't think, couldn't reason, couldn't escape. The footsteps grew louder. They were coming closer. I had no more fight left in me. A cold hand gripped my shoulder, icy fingers pressing into my skin. I didn't dare look up. I couldn't. And then, in the silence that followed, the phone rang once more. But this time, it wasn't just a ring. It was a scream. A low, distorted wail that tore through the air, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundation of the room. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling, my breath ragged. This time, there was no question. I had to answer. I had no choice. I picked it up. "David." The voice was soft, almost sad now. And then it added, in a tone so final, so cold, "We're done." The air shifted. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me as if they were alive. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room was closing in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter around me. The phone slipped from my hand. It hit the floor with a soft thud. And then the room was silent again. The footsteps stopped. The air grew still. For a moment, I thought it was over. That I had finally escaped. That the phone calls, the footsteps, the voice, it was all just a dream. But then I heard it, in the silence of the dark room. A whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. "David." And then I understood. It wasn't over. Not for me. Not for anyone. The call would never stop. It would never stop calling my name. What would you do if you woke up to find the world completely empty? What if every street, every store, every familiar place you walked by was utterly silent, abandoned, as though no one had ever been there at all? I asked myself those questions over and over that morning as I stumbled out of bed, rubbing my eyes. At first, I thought it was a dream. The alarm hadn't gone off, and the usual morning noises, the faint hum of traffic outside, distant voices of people on their way to work, were gone. But I could feel something strange in the air, like the very atmosphere had changed overnight. I opened my bedroom window, expecting to hear the usual sounds of the city, the faint rustle of leaves, the quiet chatter of people on the street below. Instead, there was nothing. Not even the distant rumble of cars or the faint murmur of conversation. Just silence. I stepped outside, hoping to find someone, anyone, to explain what was going on. My apartment complex looked the same as always, but it felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air. I walked down the stairs to the street level, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the quiet space. The street was deserted. The sidewalks were empty. Not a single person in sight. I called out, but my voice seemed to dissolve into the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept walking, hoping to find some answer. Maybe people had just stayed home for some reason, or there was some sort of emergency. But every block I turned, every alley I wandered down, confirmed that it wasn't just a strange coincidence. The city was empty. I checked my phone, hoping to find a message or some sign of life, but the screen was blank. No calls, no texts. Just a dead phone. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing against my chest. My breath felt shallow, and I found myself walking faster, my pulse quickening. Then I saw it. At the end of the street, there was a figure standing in the middle of the road, unmoving, as though they had been waiting for me. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see his eyes, wide and intense, almost unnerving. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. My instinct was to run, but something about the way he stood there, waiting, made me take a step forward. As I approached, my heart pounded in my chest, the silence around us almost deafening. While I was only a few feet away, the man finally spoke. His voice was low, almost whispering, but it carried the weight of something much darker. "You're still here," he said, his words hanging in the air between us. I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? Where is everyone?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering me. "They've gone," he said finally. "They've crossed over to the other side. And you're next." A chill ran down my spine. His words didn't make sense, and yet, somehow, they did. There was an unsettling certainty in his voice, something cold and final. The way he said it, "You're next," felt like a warning, but it also felt like something inevitable. "What do you mean? What do you mean, they've gone?" I stammered, trying to make sense of his cryptic words. "Where did they go?" The man didn't move, but his eyes seemed to bore into me, almost like he was looking right through me. "Beyond. They've crossed beyond the boundary. And now it's your turn." I stepped back, my mind racing. "No. I don't understand. I need to find someone. I need to." "Everyone else is gone," he interrupted, his voice cold. "You're the only one left." I couldn't breathe. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest, pushing all the air from my lungs. "No. This can't be real." The man's face twitched into something like a smile, but it was more unsettling than comforting. "It's real. And it's only a matter of time before you join them." I looked around frantically, hoping someone would appear, hoping I could hear something, anything, that would reassure me. But the silence was complete. The emptiness stretched out before me, a vast, unknowable void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. "Why?" I whispered, barely able to voice the question that was gnawing at the edges of my mind. The man took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "Because there is no escaping it. You'll learn soon enough." And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the empty street. I watched him go, my mind spinning, my body frozen in place. What did he mean? Where had everyone gone? And what was this other side he had mentioned? The city felt different now, more suffocating, more oppressive. The emptiness around me seemed to close in, and I suddenly realized that I was alone. Completely alone. Everyone I knew, everyone I had ever seen, was gone. I didn't know what to do. There were no answers. No signs. Just the silence and the vast, empty city stretching out before me. I didn't know how long I stood there, lost in my own thoughts, but when I finally moved, it felt like I was walking through a dream. Or a nightmare. Nothing made sense. The world around me had shifted, and I was the only one left to witness it. The question echoed in my mind again, louder this time, what now? The city seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its familiar skyline now unnerving in its emptiness. My heart raced as I walked down the silent streets, the weight of isolation pressing against me from all sides. There was no sound, No cars, no voices, no distant hum of human activity. Only the sound of my own footsteps, breaking the oppressive silence. I needed to find answers. I couldn't just stand here, lost and alone in a world that made no sense. My mind kept returning to the man I had met in the street, his cryptic words echoing in my head. They've crossed over. You're next. What did he mean by that? Where had everyone gone? I walked past empty shops, deserted homes, and silent buildings. The streets were untouched, like the world had been frozen in time. Everything seemed normal, yet everything was wrong. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of panic. It was as if the city had simply been abandoned overnight. I stopped at a park, hoping to find some sign of life. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, but no children played. The benches sat empty, as if waiting for people who would never come. I walked to the fountain, its water still flowing, but no one was there to enjoy it. There had to be someone. There had to be some explanation for all of this. I couldn't be the last person left. I refused to believe it. As I stood by the fountain, I thought I heard something soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper carried on the wind. I turned quickly, scanning the empty park, but there was no one there. Just the quiet rustling of leaves. I moved on, my thoughts tangled in confusion. Was this some kind of experiment? A dream? Or was it something worse? I found myself standing in front of a small convenience store. The door was unlocked, so I pushed it open. The bell above the door rang faintly, breaking the silence, and I stepped inside. The shelves were stocked with everyday items, the kind of things you'd expect to see in any small shop. But there were no customers. No shopkeeper. No sign of anyone at all. I moved slowly through the aisles, my eyes scanning for any clue, any sign of life. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I reached the back of the store, where the cold drinks were kept. As I opened the refrigerator door to grab a bottle of water, I heard it again, the whisper. It was clearer now. David. I froze. My name. I quickly closed the fridge, my hand trembling. My heart pounded in my chest. Who was calling me? Who was whispering my name? I glanced around the empty store, but there was no one. I ran out of the store, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my mind reeling. I couldn't stay in one place for too long. I couldn't just wait for whatever was happening to consume me. I continued walking through the city, my steps growing more frantic with each passing minute. I needed to find someone. I needed to understand what was going on. The further I walked, the more the city began to feel like a maze. Streets that should have led to familiar places now seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I walked in circles, retracing my steps only to find that the landmarks I had passed moments before were now gone or distorted. Buildings I thought I recognized had changed in subtle, unnerving ways. Windows that were once intact were now shattered, doors that had been closed were wide open. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was just another mirage. A person, standing on the edge of the sidewalk, watching me. She was tall, with long dark hair that blew in the wind, but her eyes were cold and empty, like she wasn't fully there. I approached cautiously, unsure whether she was real or just another trick of my mind. As I got closer, she turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You're still here," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I took a step back, a chill creeping down my spine. "Where is everyone?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. What's happening? Why am I the only one left? The woman's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. You're not the only one, she said. But soon, you will be. I felt my stomach twist in fear. What do you mean? What is this? Where did everyone go? Her smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something darker in her eyes. They crossed over. They left this place. And now you will follow. I shook my head, not understanding. No. I'm not going anywhere. I don't know what's happening, but I won't. I won't just disappear. The woman's smile returned, but this time it was cold, almost mocking. You have no choice. The boundary has been crossed. There is no going back. I took a step back, my pulse racing. No. I refused to believe it. I won't just vanish like everyone else. She tilted her head, studying me with an unnerving calmness. It's already happening. You can feel it, can't you? The change. The shift. You're already slipping. You just don't know it yet. I stumbled away from her, panic rising in my chest. I turned and ran, but as I did, I felt a strange pull at the back of my mind, as though something was trying to reel me in. It was the same sensation I had felt earlier, the oppressive weight of the silence, the feeling of being drawn towards something I couldn't escape. I glanced behind me, but the woman was gone. The street was empty once more, just like it had been before. But I could still feel her words lingering in my mind. You're slipping. And as I walked on, the city around me felt more and more like a place that was unraveling, a place where reality itself was starting to bend and break. What did she mean by that? Was I already lost? I couldn't shake the feeling that the city was alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. It was watching me, waiting for me to cross some invisible line. I had no idea what that line was, or if it was even real, but it was there, hovering just beyond the edge of my awareness. The more I walked, the more the city seemed to change. Buildings blurred at the edges, their outlines becoming distorted as if they were slowly being erased from existence. Streets I had walked 100 times before now seemed unfamiliar, twisting and stretching in ways I couldn't explain. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the lack of anything, no birds, no wind, no distant hum of cars or people. There was only the cold, relentless stillness. It felt like I was alone in a world that was slowly being forgotten. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stand still, not with the strange pull that seemed to be guiding me forward, urging me towards something I didn't understand. I walked for hours, or maybe it was days. I couldn't tell anymore. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this place. Every corner I turned only led to more empty streets, more desolation. I was beginning to wonder if I had crossed that line already, if this place was the last stop before I, too, vanished. I stopped in front of an old church, its stone facade worn and cracked from years of neglect. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peering out from the inside. Without thinking, I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the musty scent of old wood filled my lungs. The pews were empty, the altar devoid of any life. But there was something unsettling about the place. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, shifting in ways that didn't quite make sense. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then, I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper from the farthest corner of the church. David. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one. The church was still, as empty as ever. My name echoed in the silence, but it wasn't a comforting sound. It was an invitation. Or maybe a warning. I took a few tentative steps forward toward the altar. The closer I got, the more the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, as if reaching for something, pulling me in. I felt the air grow colder, and a deep sense of dread washed over me. This place, this church, wasn't just abandoned. It was a doorway, a threshold, and I was standing at the edge. I didn't want to cross that line, but I couldn't leave either. There was something here I needed to understand, something that could explain why I was the last one left. At the altar, I found a small, withered book. It lay open, as if waiting for me to read it. I knelt down slowly, my fingers trembling as I turned the pages. The text was faded, nearly illegible in some places, but there was one thing I could make out, written in thick, dark ink. When the last one stands, the end will come. I read it again, the words sinking into my mind like a weight I couldn't shake. The end? What end? Was I truly the last one? Was this city already lost, or was there still a chance to escape? I slammed the book shut, panic rising in my chest. I didn't want to face the truth. I didn't want to know what came next. But there was no denying it. This was happening, and I was running out of time. Suddenly, the door to the church slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The silence grew deeper, more oppressive. I could feel the walls closing in, the shadows creeping toward me like fingers, wrapping around my mind. I looked up and saw her again, the woman from the street. She was standing at the back of the church, her face unreadable. Her eyes, though, her eyes were full of something now, something dark, something ancient. "You've been brought here for a reason," she said softly, her voice like a soft breeze. "You're at the edge now, David. The threshold. Once you step across, there's no going back." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you want from me? Why am I still here? What happened to everyone else?" The woman stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, like the very air around me was charged with her energy. "They've crossed over. This place, it's not for the living anymore. It's a waiting room. And you're the last one left." "Waiting for what?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "For you," she replied, her smile both cruel and sad. "For the moment when you accept your place here." I backed away, my heart racing. "No, I won't accept this. I won't just disappear like the others." She tilted her head, studying me with a gaze that felt like it was piercing through me. "You don't have a choice, David. You're already slipping. You've crossed the line without even realizing it." I felt it then, a tug at the edges of my consciousness, a slow, insidious pull. It wasn't just the city that was changing. It was me. Something was happening inside me, something I couldn't control. My mind felt distant, like it was floating away from my body. The woman reached out, her cold fingers brushing my cheek. "It's too late. You've already crossed over." The room spun, the shadows growing darker, the air thicker. My legs felt weak, my vision blurring. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. I looked one last time at the woman, but her face was already fading, dissolving into the darkness. And then, there was nothing. I woke up with a start. The sudden surge of awareness hit me like a shock. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was gasping for air as if I had been submerged underwater. My head spun, and I couldn't quite place where I was. The room was dark, but it felt wrong. I wasn't in the church anymore. No, the cold stone beneath me, the lingering shadows, the oppressive silence, it was all gone. But something else replaced it, something that made me feel even more lost. I was back in the city. Or at least, it looked like the city. The streets were familiar, yet everything seemed hollow, as though the world had been drained of its essence. The buildings loomed around me, but they were empty, their windows dark and lifeless. I stood up, my legs unsteady. The air was thick, heavy, like it had been holding its breath for far too long. I took a hesitant step forward, only to hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The street remained as empty as it had been moments ago. Was I still dreaming? Had I crossed some threshold, some boundary between worlds? The woman's words echoed in my mind, "You've crossed over." But crossed over to what? I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. But as I took another step, the very ground beneath me seemed to pulse, as if it were alive and aware of my every move. The air around me seemed to warp and distort, the buildings twisting in ways that defied logic. I stumbled, catching myself against a nearby wall, only to find that the wall didn't feel like a wall at all. It was too soft, like fabric, stretching and shifting beneath my touch. I pulled my hand away quickly, a surge of panic rising in my chest. This wasn't real. None of this was real. But it looked real. It felt real. I could still smell the damp concrete, hear the distant hum of electricity, feel the sharp sting of cold against my skin. And then there was a voice. David. I froze. It was her voice again, the woman from the church. She was here, somewhere, calling to me from the shadows. David. Her voice was closer this time, but I couldn't see her. I spun around, eyes darting, searching, but the street was as silent as ever. No footsteps, no rustling of clothes, nothing. Where are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. My throat felt dry, as if I hadn't spoken in days. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. But the more I thought, the more my thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. David, you don't understand, she said softly, her voice reverberating through the empty street. This is the end. The final stage. You're here because you were meant to be here. I clenched my fists. What do you mean? What do you want from me? I could feel her presence now, just behind me, like a shadow cast over my very soul. She was there, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I was afraid of what I might see. This is where everything ends, she continued, her voice soft, but somehow filled with a dark finality. This is the boundary between what was and what will never be. The others have crossed. You're the last one. I took a step back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. The last one? Yes. They're all gone now, David. The city is empty because it was never real to begin with. It was always just a momentary reflection, a place for the lost to linger before moving on. Moving on? My voice was barely a whisper. Where? Her silence was deafening. For a long time, there was only the sound of the wind, a low, mournful sigh that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as though the entire world was waiting for something, holding its breath, suspended in time. And then, I felt it. A shift. A tearing, like reality itself was being pulled apart. The ground beneath me shook, the air grew even heavier, and a strange, tingling sensation spread through my limbs. Something was coming. I could feel it approaching, closing in on me. A presence, vast, unknowable, and deeply unsettling. It was as though the fabric of the world was unraveling, and I was the last thread holding everything together. "David, it's time," she said, her voice now a mere whisper in the wind. I turned to face her, but she wasn't there. All that remained was the endless street, the darkened buildings, the swirling shadows that seemed to consume everything in their path. I didn't know what she meant. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew that I couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere to go. No way to escape. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. And then, the world collapsed. I woke up, but I wasn't sure if I was awake at all. The first thing I noticed was the absence of sound. The constant hum of the city, the whisper of distant conversations, the occasional car passing by, all of it was gone. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating, like the world itself had held its breath. I opened my eyes, but everything was the same. The streets were empty. The buildings were still there, looming, but they felt distant, unfamiliar. I could see them in great detail now, each crack in the pavement, each piece of dust hanging in the air, suspended like a frozen memory. Everything was so sharply defined, but it felt wrong. I moved, slowly at first, my feet hesitant against the ground. The air around me was thick, like it had been soaked in something dark and heavy. I could feel it pressing in on me, wrapping around my chest, making each breath feel labored. My pulse was racing, thumping in my ears, but there was no escape. I was trapped here, in this place that wasn't a place, in a world that wasn't a world. I needed to understand. I needed to know what happened to everyone, why they were gone, and what was waiting for me on the other side of this thing. I was the last one, the woman had said. But the last of what? The last of who? The familiar streets, once full of life, now felt like a maze. I turned corners, walked through alleys, but no matter where I went, everything felt like it was closing in. The buildings stretched higher, their windows black and lifeless, and the shadows grew longer with each step I took. It was as if the city had been reduced to a memory, a place I had known, but no longer recognized. I kept walking, driven by an instinct I didn't understand, until I found myself at the edge of the city. The end of the road. The place where the buildings stopped and the nothingness began. The woman's voice, soft but clear, broke through the silence. "David." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. There she was, standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible but unmistakable. She didn't move, just stood there, watching me, waiting. "You're ready now," she said, her voice distant, but it felt like it was all around me, filling the space with its cold certainty. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? What could I possibly say to her, to this? Where am I? What is this? I finally managed to croak, my voice cracking with fear and confusion. "This is the boundary," she said, her words like a whisper against the wind. "The line between what was and what will never be. Between life and something else." I took a step back, my legs weak. The others, they crossed over? Where did they go? Her eyes, though hidden in the shadows, seemed to gleam with a strange, knowing light. They've crossed the line. They're beyond it now. But you, You're different. Different? I repeated, my throat tight. What does that mean? You were always meant to cross. But you're the last one. The last to decide. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. Decide? Decide what? You'll understand soon enough, she said. Her voice was softer now, almost soothing, like a lullaby, but there was something terrifying in it. You're ready. The city is gone. The people are gone. All that's left is for you to step through. To move on. I looked at her, trying to make sense of her words, but it felt like I was grasping at smoke, my thoughts slipping away faster than I could catch them. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled. I looked down to see cracks spreading through the asphalt, deep and jagged, like the earth itself was splitting open. I heard the faintest sound, like something shifting in the distance, and then the wind picked up, howling around me. You've been standing on the edge for so long, David, she said, her voice fading, swallowed by the rising wind. It's time. The cracks in the ground widened, and I felt myself being pulled toward them. I tried to resist, but the force was too strong. My feet slid forward, as if the very ground was eager to swallow me whole. I turned to look at her one last time. She was still there, standing in the shadows, her face unreadable. But I knew that whatever was coming next, I had no choice but to face it. I stepped forward, my body moving against my will, my mind screaming, my heart pounding in my chest. And then everything went dark. I don't know how long I was falling. Time felt meaningless here. The sensation was not a gravity pulling me downward, but being pulled in every direction at once, as though I were being torn apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the falling stopped. I opened my eyes, but I didn't recognize anything. There were no streets, no buildings, no sky. Just an endless void stretching on in every direction with no beginning and no end. I was alone. And yet, I could feel the presence. I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing against me, surrounding me, suffocating me. There was no sound, no air, no life. But there was something just beyond my reach. Something I couldn't see, but knew was there. And I was trapped, caught in this endless nowhere, waiting for something I didn't understand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was beyond the line now, and I had nowhere left to go. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be the last person on Earth? To be the only one left? I thought I knew. I thought I understood the loneliness of waiting for the bus after midnight, with nothing but the dim streetlights flickering overhead, casting long shadows on the empty road. But I was wrong. That kind of loneliness is a small thing. What I felt that night was something far worse. I had finished my late shift at the diner and was heading home. It was one of those nights where the air feels thick, like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The streets were quiet. Most of the shops were closed, their windows dark and silent. I had missed the last train, and now I was on the very last bus of the night, the one that would take me through the empty streets, past the quiet park and the shadowed alleyways, all the way to my apartment. I sat down by the window, trying to shake off the weariness that weighed on my shoulders. The bus was mostly empty, just a few passengers scattered here and there, all of us heading to our separate destinations. The bus hummed softly, the wheels turning against the road, and the familiar rattling of the old vehicle almost lulled me to sleep. But there was something about the night, something in the air, that kept me awake. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the bus made its way through the dark streets. The city seemed to be holding its breath, just like I was. No cars passed us. No footsteps echoed through the streets. It was like the world had gone still, frozen in time. At the first stop, a couple of people got off. They stepped out into the darkness, their faces unreadable, and the bus door slid shut behind them with a soft whoosh. I didn't pay much attention to them. I was used to the routine, to the rhythm of the bus making its stops, the people coming and going, until it was just me and the driver. The next stop came, and one more person left, disappearing into the night. But there was one person still sitting across from me. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a heavy coat that looked too warm for the weather. He didn't seem to be in any hurry to get off. I glanced at him briefly, but he didn't meet my eyes. He just stared straight ahead, his face hidden in the shadows, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The bus continued its journey, and I noticed that the number of passengers had dwindled down to just a handful. Every time the doors opened, another person stepped out and vanished into the night. The bus seemed to be getting quieter with each stop, the sound of the engine growing louder in the stillness of the night. I looked out the window again, watching the dark streets pass by. I didn't know why, but the emptiness felt wrong, like something was missing. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the late hour, just exhaustion creeping in. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I became. And then it happened. The last passenger got off. The doors closed behind them, and the bus lurched forward with only the driver and me left inside. I could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead, the steady sound of the engine, but it felt like the world outside had stopped moving. The city was completely still. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. Except for the man across from me. He was still sitting there, unmoving, silent. I stared at him, the hairs on my arms prickling. There was something about him that felt off. Something in the way he sat perfectly still, his head tilted slightly forward as if he was deep in thought, but never once moving. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself he was just tired, like me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The bus continued its journey, but the silence between us felt unbearable. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, pounding against my skull. Every minute stretched on forever. Then, I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, something like a breath, a sigh, just a little too soft to be real. It was so quiet, I wasn't sure if I imagined it. But I felt it. The tension in the air thickened, like the very atmosphere had shifted. I glanced over at the man again. He was still staring straight ahead, his eyes hidden in shadow. But something was different. His presence, his stillness, it wasn't natural. It felt like he wasn't really there at all. I tried to look away, to focus on anything else. But my eyes kept drifting back to him, drawn to the space he occupied, as though it were too empty. His very existence felt like a disruption in the quiet. It was as if the darkness around him had deepened, had folded in on itself. Then the bus came to another stop. The doors opened with a soft hiss, but no one got on. There was only the empty road, the silence, and the weight of the man sitting across from me. The driver didn't say anything, didn't look back. He was just as quiet as the rest of the world. I felt the urge to stand, to get off, to escape whatever this was. But my feet felt glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. And then I saw it, the subtle shift in the man's posture. His head tilted slightly to the side, just enough to suggest movement. but it wasn't natural movement. It was deliberate, slow. And then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something else. His hand. It wasn't folded in his lap anymore. It was stretched out toward the aisle, fingers curling as if he was reaching for something or someone. That's when I knew. He wasn't a passenger. Not anymore. And that's when I realized I wasn't just on the last bus of the night. I was on the last bus for me. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, as though the air had thickened around me, pressing down on my chest. The man's hand, pale and long-fingered, stretched slowly across the aisle, inching toward me with a precision that made my stomach turn. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs refused to cooperate, frozen to the cold floor of the bus, even as I felt the unmistakable weight of his attention on me. The bus rolled forward, the only sound the quiet hum of the engine and the faint, eerie creak of the old seats. The city outside blurred in the corners of my vision, shadows passing like fleeting memories. I was aware, painfully aware, of every inch of the space between the man and me, the emptiness that had once felt ordinary, but now felt like a vast chasm I couldn't cross. His hand stopped, hovering just a few feet away from my own. I tried to look away, but my eyes were drawn back to him, to the unnatural stillness that surrounded him. His face, half hidden in shadow, remained expressionless. Yet, I felt the pull of his presence like a gravitational force, as though he was not just occupying the seat across from me, but entirely filling the space in ways that were impossible to explain. It was then that I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. His fingers, pale and delicate, were twitching ever so slightly, as though they were waiting for something. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. Maybe he was just another late-night commuter, someone who'd missed the last stop like me, someone too tired to speak. Maybe he was just like me. But as I glanced around the bus, I realized the truth. I was the only one left. Everyone else had gotten off, vanished into the night. There was no one else here. Just the man, sitting in front of me, his hand creeping closer, closer, like some kind of slow-motion nightmare. My pulse quickened. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry, the sensation of his gaze heavy and suffocating. I fought the urge to look away, to pretend he wasn't there. But there was no escaping it. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. Then, the bus jolted to a stop. I almost fell forward, the sudden motion snapping me out of my paralysis. The doors hissed open, and for a moment, I thought maybe the man would get off. Maybe this was just another stop, another ordinary moment in a very ordinary night. But the man didn't move. The doors remained open for a few moments, as if inviting him to step out. But the air outside felt wrong. The streetlights cast strange, flickering shadows across the pavement, like the light was afraid to touch the ground. No one was there to board the bus. Just the empty street and the chilling silence. I glanced at the driver. He hadn't moved either, his hands gripping the wheel, his face obscured by the rearview mirror. His gaze never left the road ahead, but something about the way he sat, so still, so tense, made me think he wasn't just waiting for the next stop. He was waiting for something else. For a long moment, everything was still. The doors were open. The empty night pressed in from all sides, the silence louder than any sound could be. The air tasted like cold metal, and I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. Finally, the doors hissed shut again. I looked back at the man across from me. His hand had inched closer. A wave of terror washed over me. He's not human. I wanted to shout, to ask the driver to do something, but the words caught in my throat. My body felt trapped in a cage of fear, like I couldn't escape the very air I was breathing. The bus began to move again, but this time it felt different. The vibrations of the engine, the rhythm of the wheels, everything had changed. The streets outside seemed to grow darker with every turn. The buildings blurred into shadows, and the air grew colder, heavier. And then I heard it. A faint sound, whispers, like voices carried by the wind. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was as if the very world outside the bus had begun to speak in a language I didn't understand. I turned my head to the side, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. No one outside the bus. Just the endless, empty streets stretching on forever. The whispers grew louder. Closer. Like they were in the very air inside the bus, creeping into my ears, slithering into my mind. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The man's lips had moved. His mouth didn't open fully, but I saw it just enough to know he wasn't silent anymore. He was speaking, but the words weren't meant for me. They weren't meant for anyone. They were for the space around us, for the bus itself. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt them, like vibrations against my skin. Each syllable seemed to cut through the silence like a blade, pulling the very reality around us apart. The temperature dropped. I shivered. My eyes snapped back to the driver. He has to know. He has to see this. But the driver hadn't moved. He hadn't even acknowledged me. The man's hand twitched again, and I realized with a horrible, dawning understanding that it wasn't just his hand reaching out to me. It was something else. Something more. The man wasn't just a passenger. He was the driver of something far darker than this bus. And then, as if to confirm that thought, the bus veered sharply to the right. The streetlights outside flickered violently, then went out altogether, plunging us into an absolute, suffocating darkness. I blinked, and for a second, I thought I saw something, a figure, a shadow, standing in the aisle. But it wasn't a person. And it wasn't human. The man didn't move. His eyes were still locked on whatever lay outside the bus. His lips barely parted, but I could hear him muttering something to himself, something that sounded like a chant. The words came in rhythmic bursts, and as they filled the air, the temperature in the bus plummeted even further. My breath came out in invisible puffs now, and I could feel the freezing air seeping into my bones. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. He had stopped being just a man. Now, he felt like something more, something not quite human. His body was rigid, and his mouth twisted as he muttered faster, almost faster than I could comprehend. His fingers twitched as if controlling something beyond my sight, as if he were manipulating the very fabric of reality itself. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but the terror in my chest silenced me. I opened my mouth, but no words came. My lungs burned as if the air was being drained from them. Then, the noise came. It was a low, groaning sound that seemed to resonate from the very foundations of the bus, like the creaking of an old building. The sound came from everywhere at once, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and it was getting louder. It was a sound that felt as if the very bus was starting to shift and warp, as if it were no longer just a vehicle but a part of something else. Something ancient. The bus shook violently. The flickering overhead lights sparked once, twice, then went out, plunging us into darkness. In the silence that followed, I could hear the unmistakable sound of something scratching against the walls, something that scraped at the metal and made my skin crawl. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it moving. Something was out there, on the other side of the walls, of the doors. The other side. My heart began to race. The bus wasn't just stuck somewhere in the city anymore. I wasn't sure where we were or what we were on. I was no longer sure the bus was even still in the city. The atmosphere around us had changed, like a heavy fog pressing in on all sides. There was a sharp tang of something metallic in the air, something I couldn't quite place. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human, but somehow wrong. There was a rhythm to the steps that wasn't quite right, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking was dragging one leg behind. The scraping noise continued, but now it was joined by the unmistakable echo of breathing. Heavy, labored, as though the creature didn't need to breathe but did it anyway, like it was trying to draw attention to itself. I dared to glance over at the man, still standing in front of the exit. His eyes had shifted slightly, but not enough to catch me looking. His face remained frozen, as though he wasn't aware of the presence outside, or perhaps he was completely aware, and that knowledge was what kept him so still. His chant grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't understand the words. They felt wrong, distorted. My ears rang with the force of it. It was as though the buzz itself was vibrating in tune with his voice, the entire metal structure bending, like something was trying to reach us from somewhere far beyond. Suddenly, the bus lurched forward, the engine roaring to life as if it had a mind of its own. The tires squealed on the road, but instead of driving in the city, we were floating. I didn't know where we were going. The lights came back on, flickering briefly before settling into a dim, sickly glow. Outside, the city had disappeared. All that remained was blackness, an endless void stretching in every direction. What's happening? I croaked, barely able to force the words out through my frozen lips. The man didn't respond at first. But then, his lips curled into a small, twisted smile. "We're leaving," he whispered, his voice low, as if speaking to himself. "It's time." I tried to move. I tried to stand up, to do something, anything, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. Fear had a grip on me so tight, it was as though it was choking me from the inside out. And then, it happened. I heard the scratching sound again, this time much closer. It was followed by a wet, squelching noise, like something being dragged across the floor. I turned, hoping to see some sign of the driver, of any help. But there was nothing. No one at the front of the bus. The seat behind the driver was empty, and the darkness was spraying out from the front of the bus like an ink blot, seeping into every corner. The creature outside had arrived. I could feel it, the presence pressing against the walls, just beyond the bus. The metal was groaning, bending, as if it were trying to contain something that wanted to break free. It was too much. The air grew so thick, it felt like I was suffocating in it. My chest tightened with every breath, as if something invisible was squeezing the life out of me. And then I saw it. A shape, dark and formless, slowly forming outside the windows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a distortion in the shadows. But as it grew larger, I realized it was real. It was moving, shifting, like it was solid and yet not, something that couldn't exist, but somehow, it was there. The creature was enormous, towering over the bus, its form indeterminate. It was made of darkness, pure blackness, as if the shadows themselves had come alive and taken shape. But there was more to it than that. It was like a living nightmare, a thing that shouldn't have existed in the real world. Its form warped and twisted, as though it were stretching out of shape, as if it were being pulled from some other realm. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the thing outside the bus. My mind refused to process what it was, or how it was possible. But I knew one thing, it was coming. The man turned his head slowly towards me, and in that moment, I knew it. He wasn't just a passenger on this bus. He was a guide, leading me to whatever waited on the other side. He was part of this. He had been part of it all along. "We're almost there," he whispered again, as the bus began to shift, lurching as if it were accelerating. But I wasn't sure where we were going anymore. All I knew was that the end was near. And whatever waited for me at the end, it wasn't human. The bus lurched again, and I thought I might fall to the floor. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold, from fear, or from something else, something deeper, more primal. The dark shape outside the window grew larger with every passing second, blotting out the last of the city's distant lights. The darkness was absolute now. There was no light, no sound, just that oppressive, suffocating blackness pressing against the bus. The man's chant hadn't stopped. If anything, it had become more fervent, more urgent. Each word seemed to stretch, to echo through the empty, hollow space inside the bus. His face was still locked in that twisted smile, his eyes never leaving mine. "You know what's happening, don't you?" he asked softly, as if we were discussing something mundane, like the weather. I didn't answer. My throat was dry, and the only sound that came out of my mouth was a strangled gasp. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg him to stop whatever this was. But the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed by fear, trapped in this nightmare with no escape. The darkness outside was moving. It wasn't just surrounding us anymore, it was taking shape. The form was becoming more defined, more solid, and it was enormous. It loomed over us, so close I could feel the oppressive weight of it pressing against the windows. It was like the night itself was reaching out with fingers made of shadow, clawing at the bus, trying to pull us into it. I looked away from the window, trying to focus on anything else. My gaze landed on the man again, and for the first time, I noticed something unsettling, his fingers. His hands, which had been still before, were now twitching, curled around the seat in front of him like claws. His skin had begun to peel away in places, revealing something underneath, something dark and writhing, like it wasn't even flesh anymore, but something other. And then I saw it. Behind him. A figure, something shifting in the shadows of the bus. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. My eyes were drawn to it, as though something was pulling me in. A figure stood near the back, tall and hunched. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured in the blackness, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it watching me, studying me, as though it knew everything about me and was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I could hear it now, soft whispers, just on the edge of my hearing. Voices that didn't belong to anyone in the bus. Words I couldn't understand. They made my skin crawl, like insects skittering just beneath the surface. "What is it?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. My hands trembled as I gripped the seat in front of me, trying to steady myself. The man turned his head slowly, his smile widening. "It's the crossing," he said, his voice dripping with a strange, sickly sweetness. "It's the final step. We've all been waiting for this moment." The words didn't make sense. "What crossing? What do you mean?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered something in that strange, rhythmic chant, his head swaying as if lost in a trance. And then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he said, "You'll understand soon enough. We're all going." And then I realized it. The bus wasn't just traveling through space. It was crossing something, somewhere. The shadows outside weren't just the absence of light, they were something else. The world I knew, the world I had come from, was slipping away. The bus wasn't just moving through the streets, it was moving between worlds. The boundary between what I understood as reality and whatever this thing was thinning. I could feel it now, the shift in the air. The reality around me felt wrong. The walls of the bus, the seats, even the air felt like it was made of something malleable, something that was changing in response to the darkness outside. I could feel it tugging at me, pulling at my very soul, threatening to tear me apart. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like something breaking. The bus jolted violently as if the very fabric of reality had split open. The windows shattered, the air turning icy cold, and the darkness outside rushed in. The figure at the back of the bus stepped forward. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was real. It was tall and skeletal, with limbs too long and too thin to be human. Its face was a blur of blackness, but its eyes, they were glowing, two small points of light in the vast emptiness of its face. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was rooted to my seat, unable to escape. The man's chant reached a crescendo, and the darkness surged forward. The figure loomed over me, and in that moment, I knew what was happening. The man had been right. I was part of this. This was no longer just a bus ride. I wasn't just going home. I was crossing. The figure reached out with hands that were not hands, but tendrils of darkness, and I felt them close around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. "It's time to go," the man whispered, his voice the last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me completely. And then, there was nothing. It started with a strange email. I didn't recognize the address at first. The name attached to it was unfamiliar too, but something about it felt wrong, like a whisper I couldn't place. I had no reason to be alarmed at first. It was just an email. It was from a neighbor I barely knew, someone who had lived one floor above me. His name was Tom, and I hadn't seen him around much, which wasn't unusual in a building like mine. But the thing that caught my attention wasn't the sender. It was the date and time the email had been sent. You see, Tom had died over a month ago. I stared at the screen, blinking, as the words in the email slowly registered in my mind. The message was brief, barely a few lines long. It read, "I know what's coming. You need to leave now, or it will be too late. The shadows are already moving. Trust no one." It made no sense. Tom had passed away a month ago. I knew this for a fact because I had overheard a conversation in the building's lobby about it. No one had seen him for a week, and the apartment had been empty since his funeral. But now, here was this email from him. My first thought was that someone had hacked into his account, using his old email to send some sort of prank message. It was the kind of thing you hear about on the news all the time, people using the names of the deceased to stir up trouble. But as I glanced at the timestamp again, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. It was as if the email had been sent from beyond the grave. I immediately checked the other emails in my inbox. There was nothing unusual, just the usual clutter of spam and updates from services I subscribed to. No other messages from Tom. But something about the email lingered in my mind, nagging at me. I decided to ignore it at first. It had to be a joke, right? Maybe someone knew I had heard about Tom's death and was playing on that. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The building was quiet, too quiet. The sounds I had grown used to, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional sounds of someone walking down the hall, had all vanished. I had grown accustomed to the ordinary noises of apartment life, but tonight everything was dead still. The silence seemed unnatural, and that's when I heard it. A faint, rustling sound from the neighboring apartment, the one Tom used to live in. It was soft at first, like paper crinkling. Then it grew louder, more distinct, like footsteps moving across the floor, slow and deliberate. I froze. My heart began to race, thumping in my chest as the noise continued. Someone was in the apartment. But that was impossible. Tom's apartment had been vacant for weeks. The noise stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, a soft tapping, like someone knocking on a door. But there was no one there. No one alive, at least. The tapping didn't stop. It continued, rhythmic, insistent, and I couldn't stop myself from creeping to the door of my own apartment, pressing my ear to it, trying to listen more closely. My breathing felt loud in my ears, but the tapping, those soft knocks, never stopped. It seemed to echo in the silence, as if it was coming from all directions at once. I hesitated, then checked the locks. Everything was secure, but still, I felt an unease crawling up my spine. The silence was suffocating, and the tapping felt wrong. It didn't belong. I glanced at the email again, the one from Tom. Trust no one. The words came back to me like a warning. I had ignored them before, but now I couldn't. There was something happening, something beyond explanation. I opened the email again, scanning it for anything I might have missed. There was no signature, no usual sign-off. Just those words. I didn't know what to do. The tapping hadn't stopped, and neither had the feeling of being watched. It was as if the walls were closing in on me, and I had nowhere to escape. I stepped away from the door, my mind racing. Maybe I should call the building manager. Maybe someone had broken in. But what if it wasn't someone? What if it was something else? Suddenly, there was a knock on my door. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood motionless, staring at the door. The knock echoed through my apartment, too deliberate, too precise to be the random sound of an intruder. There was a coldness to it that made my skin prickle, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was probably just someone from the building, someone knocking by mistake. Maybe someone had heard the strange noises and thought I was the one making them. Maybe they were checking on me, wondering if I had heard something too. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. That knock didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like an invitation. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but it was only a few seconds. The air around me seemed to thicken, each passing moment stretching longer than the last. The knocking didn't stop. It was rhythmic, consistent. It was waiting for something. I had to move. Slowly, I crossed the room, my legs trembling beneath me. The closer I got to the door, the stronger the sense of dread became. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking. I shouldn't open it. I knew that. But my mind was consumed by the question, What was on the other side? What was really there? I pulled the door open just a crack, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. The hallway outside was dark, the only light coming from the dimly lit stairwell at the far end. There was no one in sight. The hallway seemed empty, the usual hum of life that accompanied the late night hours gone. No neighbors walking by, no sounds from the other apartments. Just silence. Then I heard it again. The tapping. It was coming from Tom's apartment, louder now, closer, as if it was moving toward me. But there was still no one in sight. I stood there, frozen, staring into the empty hallway, feeling the weight of something watching me from the shadows. That's when I noticed it. A faint, dark shape standing just outside Tom's door. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the dim hallway lights, maybe a reflection from an old mirror or the shadow of a piece of furniture. But as I stared, the shape didn't waver. It stayed there, perfectly still. A figure. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was tight, as if something was gripping it. My mind was screaming for me to close the door, to lock it, to get away, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from that shape. It wasn't a person, it couldn't be. It was too tall, too thin, and it had no distinct features, just a black outline that seemed to absorb the light around it. The air grew colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt the oppressive weight of something dark, something wrong, pressing against me. My heartbeat quickened, and a wave of nausea swept over me. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as though I was rooted to the spot, held in place by that unnatural presence. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. And then, in the silence of the hallway, I heard the softest sound, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It sounded like a voice I knew, one I had heard before, but I couldn't place it. It was Tom's voice. Get out. The words were barely audible, carried by the eerie stillness that had settled around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. But nothing made sense anymore. Tom had died a month ago, and yet his voice was here. It was coming from the figure, or maybe from somewhere else, but it was unmistakable. Get out, it repeated, this time louder, the voice tinged with an almost desperate urgency. But there was something else beneath the words, something dark, something that twisted the voice into something monstrous. Suddenly, the figure shifted, just slightly. It moved closer, and with each small step, the temperature seemed to drop even more. The hallway was freezing now, my breath visible in the air, swirling in front of me like smoke. I slammed the door shut. For a moment, I stood there, leaning against it, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess. What was happening? What was that thing? But before I could process anything further, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sudden sound made me jump, and I fumbled to pull it out. The screen lit up, and I saw the email app open. Another message. From Tom. It's too late. They know you're still here. I felt the blood drain from my face. They know you're still here. I stared at the message, unable to look away, unable to think straight. That figure outside my door wasn't the only one watching me. There was something else out there, something that knew I was still in this apartment. And it wasn't going to stop until I was gone. A sharp knock echoed through the door. It was the same rhythm. It was waiting. I pressed my back harder against the door, as if I could somehow will myself through the wall to escape. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The phone buzzed again in my hand, but I didn't want to look at it. I already knew what it would say. The message was waiting for me, pressing against my mind, just like the knocking outside. But curiosity, or maybe terror, forced me to glance down at the screen. Another message from Tom. "They found me." The words struck me like a cold fist to the stomach. Who had found him? He was gone. Dead. A month ago, they told me. I had buried him. But now, his name was echoing in my mind with every sound, every knock, every whisper. My hands trembled, but I couldn't ignore the sickening feeling that this, whatever this was, wasn't just about Tom. It was about something much worse. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. I froze. The silence felt heavier than before, suffocating. The cold air that had been swirling around me seemed to press in even tighter, like a vice. I couldn't hear anything from outside the apartment, not even the hum of the building's old pipes or the distant sound of the city. Only the buzzing of my phone filled the quiet, now more insistent, more oppressive. I had to look. I had to know. With trembling hands, I opened the email again. "They can't get me. But they're coming for you." I felt the blood drain from my face. The words weren't just a warning anymore. They were a promise. A chilling, undeniable truth that I could no longer escape. The shadows outside the door began to shift. At first, it was just a flicker at the corner of my vision. A dark ripple in the air, too fleeting to focus on. But then it grew, slowly, like ink spreading in water. The shape outside the door was no longer just an outline. It had depth now, a form, but it was wrong. It wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, too thin. And its head, there was something in the shape of its face, something that reminded me of a skull, but it was covered by a veil of black, like a curtain made of night itself. My breath hitched. I knew what it wanted. I knew what it was. It was a shadow, a thing that lived in the spaces between the living and the dead, and it had come for me. I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for my phone once more. I needed to leave. I needed to run. But my fingers felt clumsy, slow. It was as if the very air around me was thickening, and the room seemed to close in on me with each passing second. A new message. Don't look back. It's already in the room with you. I felt a cold hand grip my chest. Panic surged through me. I had to move. I had to get out of here. The walls seemed to grow closer, and every corner of the apartment felt suffocating. I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to the shifting shadows outside. And then there was a sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, like a whisper. Then it grew, steadily, until it filled the room with its presence. A soft scratching, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing. Wet, heavy, labored breathing, coming from the other side of the door. My body trembled. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The thing outside the door was there. It was waiting for me, just like the email had said. It had already found me, and I knew, deep in my gut, that there was no way out. The breathing grew louder. Closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but my throat was tight. My feet were frozen to the floor, as if the very air around me was holding me in place. Another knock. A single, deliberate knock, and then the door creaked open, slowly, as though something on the other side was forcing its way in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The door was opening. Something was coming through. The shadows, they were crawling into my room, reaching out, stretching with long, unnatural limbs. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I would survive this night. But I knew one thing for certain: whatever this thing was, whatever force had taken Tom's place and now came for me, it would never stop. It would never let me go. I only had one chance to escape. I turned toward the window. The dark shape in the doorway was almost fully formed now, the outline of a creature that existed only in nightmares. But the window was open. The wind was howling outside, and I could see the dim lights of the city below, distant, unreachable, but a chance to flee. With a cry, I ran for it. But as I moved, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The scratching, the breathing. It wasn't just behind me anymore. It was all around me. I was surrounded. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed to get away, to escape, to survive. But the shadows, they were everywhere. They swirled around the room, creeping along the walls, stretching their tendrils into every corner, filling the space with an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the very air. I was suffocating, and the panic was choking me, making every step heavier, every breath more labored. I reached the window, my fingers fumbling against the latch. The wind outside had grown stronger, battering against the glass as if it, too, wanted to break free from whatever was closing in on me. My hands were slick with sweat, and the sounds of movement behind me were getting louder, scraping, slithering, breathing. I felt them getting closer, closer with every passing second. The window wouldn't open. My fingers slipped on the metal frame, too frantic to get a good grip. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I had to get out. There had to be another way. And then I heard it. A voice. Low and guttural. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a whisper. It was more like a growl or rasping sound, barely audible but somehow clear. You can't leave. I froze, the words hitting me like a physical blow. They weren't meant for my ears. They were meant to hold me in place. I could feel it. The shadows were alive, stretching out, wrapping around my ankles, my legs, pulling me toward the center of the room. You're already gone. The voice was closer now, a mere breath away from my ear, sending a wave of ice down my spine. I jerked away from the window, panic taking over as I stumbled backward. My back hit the wall. The shadows were thick now, suffocating, pulsating with a rhythm that was almost alive. The scratching sound was louder, more distinct. It was the sound of claws scraping against wood, nails dragging across the floor, coming closer, closer. I needed to think. I needed to get out, but my mind was spinning, clouded with fear. Tom's messages were still fresh in my mind. They're coming for you, he'd said. And I had no doubt now, whatever this was, it wasn't just some random occurrence. It wasn't just my imagination running wild. I had to survive this. And then, as if summoned by my fear, the knocking began again. 3 slow knocks, precise, deliberate. It wasn't just at the door anymore. It was at the windows, at the walls, the ceiling. The entire apartment trembled with each impact, as if the very building was shaking under the weight of whatever was outside. What was happening? I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the world to make sense again. The shadows were everywhere, pressing in from every angle. I could feel them closing in, like they were dragging me into their depths, their blackness. The air grew colder, and the whispering, the growling voice, was inside my mind now. You can't escape. I didn't know how long I stood there, trapped in the grip of those shadows. Every second felt like an eternity, every breath more shallow than the last. I was suffocating, not from lack of air, but from the overwhelming sense that something unseen, something dead, was right beside me, waiting. The voice, it was becoming clearer now, sharper. Tom. It sounded like him, like his voice, but wrong. Twisted. You're already here, with me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I couldn't just let it happen, whatever it was. My eyes snapped open. The room was changing. The shadows were moving, not just in the corners of the room, but toward me, like they were feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. The air was thick with them, suffocating me, pressing down, and I knew that I wasn't just running from the shadows. I was running from something else, something worse. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a lamp, and threw it at the window. The glass shattered, but there was no relief. The shadows poured in through the broken window, a tide of dark smoke, thick and suffocating. I was no longer in control. You're one of us now. The voice echoed in my head. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was part of the dark, part of the force that was closing in, wrapping itself around me, binding me to the shadows. I gasped for air, but it was useless. The room was no longer the apartment I had known. The walls had vanished, replaced by an endless void of darkness. The shadows swarmed around me, pressing in from all sides. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just like that, it all stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Silent. The darkness hung in the air like a heavy fog. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear. I couldn't feel. But then, a voice. Tom's voice, but this time it wasn't a growl. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear. It was final. It's your turn now. And just like that, I understood. This wasn't about escaping. It was never about surviving. The shadows weren't just after me, they were after everyone. And they were never going to stop. I had become one of them. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes, hours, or days. Everything had lost its meaning. The darkness was infinite. The silence unbearable. It felt like I was floating, suspended in a void where time and space no longer had any power. My senses had dulled, but I could still hear the faintest hum, like static on a broken radio. I was no longer alone. They were with me, around me, in me. They whispered, whispers that were more like feelings, more like images in my mind, like shadows of thoughts. I could no longer distinguish where their presence ended and where mine began. We were one, tangled together in the endless dark. You're not the first, one voice whispered, Tom's voice again, but now it was like a memory, distant and detached. You won't be the last. The realization hit me harder than anything else before. I had thought that I was running from something, a threat, an enemy. But no! The shadows were not just after me. They were the end. They were the void that claimed anyone who wandered too close, a force beyond death itself. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed whole, absorbed by the vast emptiness around me. There was no air here, no sound, no light. Only the endless pressure of the shadows, pressing in from every side, tightening their grip around me. The cycle continues, the voice murmured, this time coming from somewhere inside my own head. It was no longer Tom's voice. It was mine. I had heard the words in the last email, the ones that Tom had sent. They had seemed strange at the time, cryptic, unsettling. But now, they made sense. The emails weren't warnings. They weren't messages from someone trying to help me. They were an invitation. A summons. A calling to join the others, those who had passed beyond the veil, trapped forever in the same void. There's no escape. I thought of my apartment, the world outside, the people who had lived normal lives, going to work, laughing, crying, living. I thought of Tom, of his last words. You've been chosen. Had I been chosen? Or had I simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? I felt the shadows close in tighter, pulling at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to consume what was left of me. There was no longer any sense of self. Only the collective, the shared experience of those who had fallen into this place before me. The last message is for you, the voice, my own voice, said. A message. The last message. I had no idea what it meant or why the voice kept repeating those words. But something in me stirred. There was something more, something I needed to understand before it was all gone. Do you remember your name? It asked. For a moment, I didn't. My name felt like a distant memory, slipping through my fingers. But then I heard it again, somewhere deep inside me, a whisper almost drowned by the darkness. I was someone. For the first time since I had stepped into this nightmare, I remembered who I was. My name, my life, the things I had left behind. It was all coming back, a flood of memories crashing through the blackness. But there was no time for remembering. The darkness was closing on me again. I had to do something. I reached into the black void, stretching my hand outward, reaching for something, anything that might pull me back, something that could break this endless cycle. But the darkness didn't let me go. It kept pulling me deeper, dragging me further away from everything I knew. And then I saw it. In the deepest, darkest part of the void, there was a flicker of light. Tiny at first, like the smallest spark. But it grew, growing larger, pulsing like a heartbeat, brighter and brighter. I reached for it, my fingers outstretched, and I felt it pulling me forward. The shadows shrieked. The void screamed. The light grew, blinding me, filling every inch of my mind. And in that moment, as the darkness began to melt away, I heard one final whisper. You'll be the last to leave. And then, just like that, everything went silent. The light enveloped me completely. It was warm. It was familiar. I could hear the faint hum of life outside, like the buzz of a forgotten memory. I blinked, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw the world around me. I was back in my apartment. The walls were the same, the windows, the furniture, the books. It was all as it had been before. But it was different now. There was something missing. And as I stood there, staring at the empty room, a cold realization washed over me. I was still here, but I wasn't alone. The shadows, they were still here, hiding in the corners, in the cracks of the walls, in the silence between the seconds. And the last message? It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a call. It was a reminder. The cycle had started again. And it wouldn't end until they had all of us. Have you ever wondered what happens to books when the library closes? What if I told you that some books never rest, that they have a life of their own after the lights go out? I've been working in the same old library for years now, years spent among dusty shelves, cracked spines, and the musty smell of pages worn with age. Most people would find it boring, even depressing. But for me, there was a quiet comfort in it. A peace in the silence that only the night could bring. It wasn't until recently that I noticed something strange. At first, it was easy to dismiss, little things that didn't make sense at the time. A book missing from a shelf here, a note left in a margin there. But over the past few weeks, the occurrences have become harder to ignore. It was past midnight when it started again. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the empty space, and I found myself straightening the books on the nearest shelf. The library had emptied hours ago, and I was the only one left, just like every other night. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was a certain heaviness in the air, like something was watching me. Waiting. I had been hearing soft rustling sounds from the far end of the library, the kind of noise you make when you think no one's around. I stopped, holding my breath, listening intently. Nothing. But the rustling started again, followed by a faint scraping noise, like the sound of a book being pulled from its place. I turned toward the sound. The library was vast, the shelves stretching high above me like walls closing in. My footsteps echoed loudly as I walked toward the source, my heart pounding in my chest. The rustling had stopped, replaced now by complete silence. It wasn't normal. It was never this quiet. I rounded a corner and stopped dead. There, on the floor, was a book I didn't recognize. It was one of the older ones, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. What struck me the most, though, was the strange symbol etched on its spine. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, twisted, unnatural, almost alive. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. As soon as my hand touched the cover, the lights above flickered. I looked up, startled, but the bulbs settled back into their steady glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like fingers. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the book. The pages were filled with faint handwriting, the ink barely legible. I could only make out a few words here and there, but one sentence stood out clearly. "They are coming tonight. Watch the shelves." A chill ran down my spine. I snapped the book shut, holding it tightly in my hands. I didn't know what this meant, but I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. As I stood there, staring at the book in my hands, I heard a door creak open behind me. It was coming from the far side of the library, the section where the oldest books were kept. I turned quickly, my heart racing in my chest. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, then stopped. I couldn't see anyone, but I wasn't alone. I gripped the book tightly and walked toward the noise. Every step seemed to amplify the silence, each one feeling heavier, more deliberate. The dim light from the overhead lamps cast eerie shadows across the shelves, making the room feel even more expansive. But as I approached the section where I heard the footsteps, I stopped. The room ahead seemed darker, more oppressive, like something was drawing me in. That's when I noticed it. The books. They were shifting. It started slowly, barely noticeable at first. But then, as I stood frozen in place, I saw it clearly. Books were being pulled off their shelves, one by one, as if an invisible hand was rearranging them. Some hovered in midair for a moment before being dropped softly onto the floor, while others slid out with a faint scraping sound. I took a step back, feeling a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. The air felt thicker now, suffocating. It was as if the library itself was alive, breathing, watching me. I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed wildly as I sprinted down the aisles, the sounds of shifting books growing louder, more frantic. I could feel something following me, something just out of sight, just behind me. The rustling grew louder, like a whisper in my ear. I reached the front desk, my breath coming in short gasps. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, half expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. The library was still. Silent again. I could feel the weight of the book in my hands, still clutched tightly against my chest. I opened it again, searching the pages for something, anything that might explain what was happening. And then I saw it. On the final page, in clear, unmistakable handwriting. You should never have opened the book. The words sent a shiver through me. It was as if the book itself had been waiting for me to read it, waiting for me to understand. And now, there was no going back. The moment the words on the page sank in, the air around me seemed to thicken, like I was breathing in something heavier than oxygen. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were slowly inching in. I shut the book with trembling hands, trying to steady my breath, but the shaking wouldn't stop. I glanced around, still expecting some ghostly figure to emerge from the dim corners, but nothing. Silence. It was deafening. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. The bookshelves loomed around me, dark and towering. They felt like they were watching, waiting. The floor creaked under my weight as I walked toward the back of the library, trying to calm my nerves. I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination, nothing had happened yet. The rustling, the books moving on their own, that had to be a trick of the mind, right? But when I reached the farthest shelf and felt the cold brush of air, my heart lurched. A book sat on the floor in front of me, just as it had before. I hadn't seen it fall, but there it was, its spine facing up, the same strange symbol etched on the cover. A chill ran down my spine as I bent down to pick it up, my fingers brushing the edges. The instant my hand touched the leather, I heard it. The softest whisper. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the lights or the settling of the old building. But no, it was unmistakable, words barely audible. I couldn't make them out clearly, but they were real, and they were coming from the book. Get out. I froze, the book still in my hands, but my mind racing. It was impossible. The whispering had come from inside the pages, but how could that be? It wasn't even loud enough to be a voice, it was just a presence, a thought that felt real, that felt like it came from somewhere else. I backed away, dropping the book to the floor with a thud, and turned to leave. That's when I noticed something that stopped me cold. The aisle behind me, the one I had just run down minutes ago, wasn't the same. The shelves had shifted. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but no matter how hard I looked, the layout was wrong. Books that had been on the left were now on the right. The rows of shelves stretched further, more twisting, like a maze that had never been there before. I swallowed hard. This wasn't right. I reached for my phone, needing something solid to ground myself. The screen lit up in the dim light, the time flashing on the display. 1:30 a.m. My breath hitched. I'd been in the library longer than I thought, but it felt like I had just arrived. The phone buzzed in my hand, and I jumped. I quickly looked at the screen, hoping for some distraction, some normalcy. It was a message. From an unknown number. I warned you, My hands trembled as I read the words again, my heart pounding. There was no name, no explanation. I could only assume it was from whoever, or whatever, was behind this madness. Was someone playing a sick joke on me? Or was this something worse, something far beyond understanding? I quickly typed back, my fingers shaking. Who is this? What do you want from me? But before I could send it, the lights flickered, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally. I heard a sound. A soft, rhythmic tap tap tap, like footsteps, coming closer. I turned around, scanning the aisles for any sign of movement, but I saw nothing. The air felt colder now, heavier, and the tap 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 grew louder, more insistent. And then, the whisper again. Leave before it's too late. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Was it the book again? Or was there something else in the library with me? I didn't know what was real anymore. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the books now rearranged in impossible formations. They were where they should have been. No, they had been moved. And in their place, there were books I had never seen before. Ancient books with strange titles, their pages yellowed with age, their covers embossed with symbols I couldn't begin to comprehend. Something was watching me. I could feel it now. The air was thick with it. I stumbled backward, bumping into a shelf, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the books around me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. But the exits, the aisles, everything was changing. It was like the library was alive, shifting around me, suffocating me. My phone buzzed again, interrupting my frantic thoughts. The message had changed. Don't trust the books. They know you now. I could hear the sound of footsteps again, closer this time, echoing through the library. The noise wasn't just from one direction, though. It was all around me. I could hear it above me, beside me, behind me. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shelves looming closer. The whispering had grown louder, overlapping, more desperate. I turned to run, my pulse hammering in my ears. But just as I reached the end of the aisle, the lights went out. A sudden, all-encompassing darkness. I stumbled in the black void, my hands outstretched in front of me, searching for something, anything, to guide me. The sound of the footsteps was louder now. Closer. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape. I could hear the rustling of pages, faint whispers, the feel of eyes on me, as though the very air in the library had come alive to swallow me whole. And then, through the silence, a new sound emerged. A book. Falling. And then, another. The books fell to the floor, one after another, like a cascade of whispers. The thuds echoed in the darkness, and the cold air around me seemed to grow even heavier. My breath quickened, and I instinctively pressed my back against the nearest shelf, trying to steady myself. The footsteps were still there, closer now, but no longer just in one direction. It was as if the entire library was alive, its walls shifting, the floors creaking beneath unseen footsteps. I couldn't breathe. The darkness felt suffocating, and the sense of something watching me was overwhelming. My hands groped the air, desperately seeking any trace of light, but there was nothing. The buzzing of my phone in my pocket startled me, and I yanked it out with shaking hands. I couldn't see the screen, but I could feel the vibrations in my fingers. Another message. You're not alone. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but there was nowhere to go. The library was vast, a labyrinth that twisted and turned in ways I couldn't begin to understand. I needed to leave, but the exits, the doors, were nowhere to be found. The aisles, once familiar, now seemed endless, stretching out into the black abyss. The sound of footsteps became a pounding drumbeat in my ears, louder and closer, as if something or someone was circling me, waiting. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. The silence between the noises was deafening, but in that silence, I could almost hear the whisper of pages turning, the soft rustle of a book being opened somewhere deep in the library. Suddenly, a single light flickered to life in the distance. It was weak, just a glimmer, but it felt like a lifeline. I didn't hesitate. I started running, my shoes slapping against the floor, the sound of my own panic echoing in the empty space. The footsteps behind me grew louder, their rhythm matching mine, but I couldn't turn around. I didn't dare. As I ran toward the light, the air grew colder, and a familiar scent reached my nose, old paper, dust, the unmistakable smell of ancient books. I rounded a corner and found myself in front of a large wooden desk. The dim light illuminated stacks of old, yellowed books, their spines twisted with strange symbols. The desk was covered in papers, most of them blank, but there was one item sitting in the middle of the desk. A book. It was open, its pages flipping on their own, as if a gust of wind was turning them. But there was no wind. No breeze. I felt an undeniable pull toward it. I couldn't explain it, something about the book was calling to me, like it had a piece of my soul trapped between its pages. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as my fingers brushed the edge of the pages, the whispers started again. Don't look. Don't open it. The words came from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around me like a vice. I hesitated, but my hand lingered. A cold, sharp feeling ran up my spine, urging me to pull away, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was inside. The pages stopped flipping, and the book settled on a single page. I leaned in closer, reading the words through the dim light. The handwriting was messy, hurried, as though written by someone desperate. The library knows you now. It's too late. It sees everything. It's coming for you. The message burned into my mind, each word sending a shiver through my body. I stepped back, panic rising in my chest. The footsteps were growing louder again, the soft taps of shoes on the floor now replaced with the sound of something heavier, something darker. The whispers turned to growls, as if the library itself was growing angry, hungry for something it couldn't have. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up in my shaking hands. I didn't even want to look, but I did. You should have listened. Before I could react, the lights went out again. The darkness that followed was absolute, thick and suffocating. I could no longer hear the footsteps, but I could feel the weight of something that wasn't human, something not of this world, moving toward me. I reached out into the blackness, but my hands met only air. Nothing was around me, yet I felt trapped. The walls pressed in closer, and I was acutely aware of every corner, every shadow, every movement. Then, in the absolute silence that followed, I heard a voice. A soft, raspy whisper right next to my ear. You can't escape. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. My pulse raced, and I forced myself to take a breath. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head. But there was nothing there. Just the oppressive dark, the suffocating quiet. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to stay calm. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, growing louder, more urgent, but the worst part was that I recognized the voice. It was mine. It was as though the library had learned my every fear, my every doubt, and was now speaking it back to me in my own voice. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. I needed to get out. But no matter where I turned, the shadows seemed to close in, the air growing colder, heavier. The library was alive, and it was waiting for me. I could feel it then, a presence, cold, deliberate, like a weight pressing against my chest. I stumbled forward, eyes straining against the blackness, trying to make sense of the shifting shapes around me. I took a step, then another, my feet moving on their own, driven by a need to escape, but where was the exit? The library had transformed, its endless aisles now a twisted maze, each turn more disorienting than the last. The walls seemed to shift and breathe, pulsing with some unseen force. The cold bite of fear gripped me. The voice that had spoken so quietly, so intimately, was still in my head, echoing like a drumbeat in the back of my mind. You can't escape. I took another step, trying to shake the feeling of being surrounded, of being watched by eyes that weren't there. The dim light that had flickered earlier, and I imagined it, was gone now. Only the oppressive darkness remained, swallowing everything in its path. And then, just as I was about to turn down another hallway, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement. Not a shadow, but a shape, tall and lean, standing perfectly still in the middle of the aisle ahead. It was there one moment and gone the next, disappearing into the shelves as if it never existed. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, breath caught in my throat. That figure, whatever it was, had been real. My mind raced. Had it been another person? A trick of the light? A figment of my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark? But no! I knew it wasn't. I heard the sound then. A soft shuffle, faint but growing louder, moving along the floor. Not footsteps, but something else. Something dragging. The sound echoed in the hallways, twisting and warping in the thick silence. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor as if the very space around me was holding me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but the fear kept me frozen. The presence was getting closer. I forced myself to look toward the source of the noise. A shape materialized in the shadows, a thin figure, its features indistinct, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. They were the only part of it that seemed alive, burning with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. My mouth was dry, the words stuck inside like stones. The figure didn't move at first. It simply stood there, its gaze never leaving me, its eyes locked onto mine, as if it were studying me. The longer I stared, the more disoriented I became. The lines of the library around me seemed to bend and twist, and I couldn't tell if the walls were closing in or if I was being drawn into its depths. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. My breath hitched in my chest, and I staggered backward, a desperate instinct to flee taking over. But there was no way out. No escape. The library was its own prison, and I was trapped within it. I turned, stumbling blindly through the dark aisles, but the figure was right behind me. I could hear its movements now, slow, deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. It was gaining on me. My pulse quickened as I broke into a sprint. The sound of dragging feet behind me grew louder, closer. The shelves blurred as I ran, panic seizing every inch of my body. I wasn't sure how long I ran for, how long I had been trapped in this nightmare. Time had no meaning in this place. I could hear the figure's breath now, raspy, uneven. It was gaining on me, its presence closing in on all sides, suffocating me. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I would be lost. It would get me. The air in the library had become thick, charged, almost alive with an energy that pulsed through the dark. The walls seemed to shift again, their edges melting and twisting into grotesque forms. The familiar shelves had become alien, their contents unreadable, their spines slick and dark. And then, just as I reached the end of a hallway, I skidded to a stop. The figure was there, blocking my path. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, but there was nowhere to run. The aisle behind me had vanished. The shelves had closed in, creating an impenetrable wall. I was trapped. I turned to face the figure. It was close now, too close, and I could feel its presence press down on me like a weight. I couldn't look away from those eyes. The glowing, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce through me. What is it? I thought. What does it want? The figure tilted its head slightly, as though studying me. Then, in the silence that followed, it spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice at all. It was a whisper inside my mind. A thought that wasn't mine. You shouldn't have read it. The words sank into me like daggers. I recoiled, my chest tightening. I didn't understand. What was it talking about? It took a step closer, and I froze. I could feel the cold air around it, the sharp, unnatural chill that seemed to reach right into my bones. It raised a hand, long and spindly, and I could see it now. Its fingers were unnaturally long, claw-like, their tips just inches away from my face. The library has chosen you. The words hit me like a slap. They were so clear, so cold, and they filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't describe. The library? Chosen me? I didn't have time to think about it before the figure reached out, its claws brushing against my cheek. Now you will understand. The air around me shifted in an instant. The light flickered once more, dim and broken, and for a split second, I saw it. The truth. The shelves around me were no longer filled with ordinary books. They were filled with something much worse. Books of knowledge. Knowledge that drove people mad. Knowledge that consumed the mind, twisted it, broke it, until there was nothing left but an empty husk of a person, bound to the library forever. I was trapped. There was no escape. The library had claimed me. And the figure was just the beginning. The room around me seemed to dissolve, the walls bending in unnatural angles, warping in on themselves like a cruel optical illusion. The books on the shelves flickered and blurred, their titles twisting, changing, almost alive. They pulsed with the same sickly glow that came from the figure standing in front of me, its long fingers still poised just inches from my skin. I couldn't breathe. The library has chosen you. I repeated the words in my head, but they didn't make sense. How could it be? How could this place of knowledge, be so wrong? I felt a cold wave of nausea sweep over me, the air in my lungs turning to lead. The figure stood still, watching me with eyes that burned like the faintest stars in an empty sky. I could feel their weight on my soul, drilling into the core of my being. The hand was still outstretched. There is no turning back. The voice echoed again, inside my head, like a whisper carried on the wind. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a roar, a sudden, deafening storm that filled the space between us. The figure moved closer, its sharp, unblinking eyes never leaving mine. You read the book. Now you must understand its meaning. I tried to speak, to deny, but the words died on my tongue. I could feel the grip of fear tightening in my chest, making it harder to breathe. I stepped back, my mind racing for some way out, some way to stop what was coming. But there was no escape. The shelves, those countless shelves, pressed in on me, their contents reaching for me, as if the very library itself were alive, and it wanted me to stay. What do you mean? I choked out, barely able to form the words. The figure didn't respond with speech. Instead, it reached out again, and this time, the long fingers brushed my forehead. Cold. So cold. There was a sharp, sudden pain, like 1,000 pinpricks, all at once, spreading from where it touched me. My body shuddered violently, and for a split second, the world around me went dark. In that darkness, I saw images, flashes of people. Faces. Those who had come before me. They were all staring at me, trapped within the pages of books. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and empty, lost, like they had been erased from time itself. I gasped for breath as the vision vanished. I was back in the library, but everything had changed. The shelves were no longer just shelves. They had become like arms, stretching and twisting in ways that defied reason. The air was thick with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. You read the book. Now, you will become the book. The words filled my mind, turning it over and over again, until I couldn't tell where they came from, whether they were mine or not. My hands began to tremble, and I reached out instinctively for the nearest shelf, grabbing hold of a book, any book. The moment my fingers brushed against the leather cover, I felt it, an overwhelming surge of knowledge, too vast and terrible to comprehend. The book whispered to me. It didn't have words. It had thoughts, dark, dangerous thoughts, creeping into my mind, poisoning it, like ink spilled onto paper, soaking in. I dropped the book, but the damage was already done. The thoughts, those foreign, invasive ideas, began to swirl in my head. They were everywhere. I could see them on the edges of my vision, hear them in the silence. The library was speaking to me. It was calling to me, pulling me into its depths. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The figure was gone. The shelves returned to their normal state, the books standing perfectly still once more. But it was different now. The oppressive silence was heavier. The air was thicker, suffocating. The weight of knowledge, ancient, forbidden knowledge, hung in the space around me. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel their eyes. The eyes of the lost souls who had come before me, trapped in the library forever. I could feel their gaze on me, urging me to understand. I didn't want to. I couldn't understand. But it didn't matter. The library was alive. And now, it was a part of me. The figure had said the truth. Now you will understand. I had read the books. I had touched them, and now their secrets were inside me, burning like fire, twisting my mind, filling me with things I could never forget. As I stood there, trembling, I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't going to leave the library. Not now. Not ever. The library had claimed me, and there would be no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. The books had been waiting, and now they had a new story to tell. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.